Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I didn't hear the first alarm because the wind was moving over the trench like a bow over a cello, humming through the bamboo flags and guy lines with a noise that felt musical rather than dangerous. Only when the generator coughed, once, like a tired animal, did I look up from the microscope. A red indicator winked on the far wall where frost had furred the paint. The digits on the environmental readout steadied, then slid down 1/10 of a degree. The cold held, the hum returned. I exhaled and cleared the condensate from my face shield with a knuckle. We were 6 weeks into the season at Little Dome Sea, 300 kilometers from the coast and a few more from the nearest permanent station, close enough to Concordia to inherit its storms, far enough to feel like our own small country under snow. Our drilling trench, our living trench, our generator arch, and the white nothing above us formed a pocket world. On the maps, we were a dot labeled with a project acronym. In the ice, we were a narrow cylinder chewing down toward air that hadn't seen sunlight since before our species learned to draw. I'm Dr. Asha Ramanathan, field microbiologist attached to the Deep Ice Campaign. My brief was simple in words and difficult in practice. Keep the cores clean, keep our instruments honest, and keep the team from convincing itself that anything ancient was automatically important. Old Ice is a patient archivist. It keeps everything, including things you don't want. We were 9 people by the time the season settled into rhythm. Elise Dubois, our calm center, managed camp operations with the effortless authority of someone who had lived several lives in polar field tents. Dr. Santiago Alvarez, a glaciologist borrowed from the British Antarctic Survey, knew the geometry of the ice like a sailor knows tides. Hannes Kruger, lead driller, could listen to the winch and tell you how happy the anti-torque was. Tynan Gada ran comms and weather and sometimes told us stories about navigation by stars we couldn't see. Sam Geller kept the piston bully and the generator alive with a mix of patience and profanity-free muttering. Dr. Kate Mork was our medic, who doubled as the person who made coffee correctly on the first try every time. Dmitry Petrov wired our trench lighting, our data lines, and, later, our hopes of getting out. Rhys O'Connell, mountaineer turned field safety lead, understood snow the way city people understand traffic. A living thing with moods. And me, the one who said no to so many sampling temptations that I sounded like a brake squealing in cold air. We built our lab inside a snow trench with plywood walls and a plastic roof, half buried to blunt the wind. The drillers ran an electromechanical system down the bore, each 10+ meter run bringing up one fragile cylinder that slid like trapped moonlight into the core handling line. The annulus was filled with a clear, low-toxicity fluid to keep the bore from closing. A sweet-smelling solvent that tried to leap into your sinuses if you forgot to keep your respirator tight. We shaved the cores in a cold room that ran just below -20, a temperature that made every metal edge sing. From the skins, we took microaliquots for metagenomic sequencing, looking for the faint whispers of microbial communities eked out in dust layers and trapped brines. The ancient ice readers among us spoke in years like they were place names. 800,000, 900,000, 1 million if the stratigraphy did as models promised. The trouble didn't come from a mistake you could name. It arrived like weather. Small deviations that aggregated until everyone pretended the new normal was the plan all along. The first deviation was a pattern in the sequencing data. Fragments that didn't map cleanly anywhere sensible. Not an organism, not a gene, but a repeating mosaic that refused to settle. I flagged it and put it into the queue behind other curiosities, where it sat like a cat under a couch, seen and not seen. The second deviation walked in wearing a human face. Hannes came into the lab after a long shift with a cut on the back of his gloved hand, a neat little nick from an aluminum edge. He held it up so Kate could paint it with antiseptic and a narrow strip of adhesive. It wasn't deep. He laughed at my concern, at my quick glance at the solvent label out of habit. "It's nothing," he said, and then passed by my bench and looked down at the microscope with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. I remember thinking only that he was tired as any driller gets, all weather and physics and repetitive care. The third deviation was sound. Not a bang, not a shout, but a tone. Somewhere in the labyrinth, some old instrument decided to announce its needs on a sustained single note, a pure sign embedded in the wind and generator noise. It went unnoticed for hours, then noticed and ignored because other work had urgency that sound could not compete with. I registered it while rinsing a slide and filed it under, "Dmitri will find it when he has a spare minute." We had spare minutes the way we had spare heat, available but budgeted. We worked. The bore went down. The season settled. The weather did what it does, which is everything. White days, white nights. The light that comes from everywhere and nowhere. In the evening, we ate together in a trench that smelled of pasta and old cardboard. The world outside was wind and flag lines. Inside was wires and frost and our own voices. When I tried to sleep, I heard the generator change pitch as loads moved. A living animal with a steady heart. I never loved rules until I worked in ice. In a place that can't afford accidents, ritual is how you keep mathematically unlikely things from piling up into a pattern. Twice daily comms window with Concordia. Daily walk of the flag lines around camp in pairs. Radios on you, not near you. Gloves on, face shield down, respirator checked when handling anything wetted by drilling fluid. If something breaks, you stop, and you and a second person make a plan before you put your hands where they shouldn't be. Not because you're afraid of one wrong move, but because you understand that one wrong move is usually a dozen small ones collecting rent. The morning the generator stumbled a second time, Sam was already in the arch, a ribbed tunnel lined with bent metal like the inside of a whale. I found her crouched by a panel, listening with her fingertips. "Fuel feed's fine," she said without looking up. "Ice in the breather, maybe, or it wants a filter and is being polite about it." "Polite generator," I said. "Everything out here has manners until it doesn't." She swapped the filter. The tone somewhere in camp was louder that day, needle precise. Dmitri traced it along a wire run with a non-contact wand until he stopped at an old beacon Tane had used when the weather closed in, one of those battery beacons that throw a steady sound for line of sight when line of sight is a prayer. It hadn't been on the last few days. Now it was, just a firm, unwavering note, a lighthouse without a lamp. "Tane," Dmitri called on the radio. "Not mine," said Tane. "But if it helps you people find your way to dinner, I'll pretend it was my idea." We laughed. We turned it off. The silence after had weight. Nobody mentioned that the tone returned a few hours later, somehow deeper in the maze. That night I processed thin shavings from a core section that had crossed an odd dust layer. Under the scope, something repeated at regular intervals, a geometric whisper. Not cellular shapes, not a filament. A lattice of absence. It mapped to nothing. I saved the capture with a tidy file name and put it in a directory I didn't share, not to hide it, but to keep from wasting anyone's attention on what might be a smudge of chance. 2 days later, Hannes missed breakfast, and everyone noticed because Hannes ate like food was a job. He arrived late with a hat under his arm, hair standing up in tufts, eyes not quite focused on our side of the room. Elise told him to sit. He did, very straight-backed, like he was pretending to be human for a photograph. When he spoke, there was nothing very wrong about his voice. It was only a little off-center. "Didn't sleep," he said. "Dream needed finishing." "What dream?" Kate asked, a doctor's question disguised as a friend's. "Running a tone sweep," he said, as if that were a normal thing to dream. "Finding resonance." The lab was colder than usual that day. The readouts all said the same numbers. I added a layer under my parka anyway. My breath had a thicker sound in the mask. In the microscope camera, that absence lattice resolved a hair sharper, as if the optics had decided to be generous. Elise made the call to pause after lunch, just to check, nobody panic. We had the habit of safety, so we followed her voice the way you follow a line in fog. Everyone checked everyone else's vitals. We talked about trivial things to hear how we were saying them. When it was my turn, Kate held the pulse oximeter on my finger and squinted at the range. "Normal," she smiled. "Eat something. You go thin when you think too much." Not all changes are violent, some are just sideways. In the evening, Hannes sat on his bunk, staring toward a wall that had nothing on it but a map of the bore depth and some duct tape holding the map in place. His eyes moved in small increments as if tracking something falling a millimeter at a time. Reese waved a hand near his face. Slow. Blink. Recognition delayed, then present. "Fine," he said when asked. "I'm fine." The voice was still there, slightly not quite. "I didn't sleep much." The generator tone again. The beacon again. A trace of something crystalline in the scope like a snowflake's shadow learning a different grammar. We added a second person to every task the next day and moved slower. Half our field work is speed by necessity. The other half is a deliberate refusal to hurry. The first time I saw someone move in a way that crossed a human line, it was in the cold room. Hannes stood at the long table where we cut and shaved, his face shield down and respirator in place. Gloved hands steady over a core segment that lay like a clean bone on the trough. He wasn't doing anything wrong, strictly speaking. He was holding still in a way that said he had entirely forgotten why he had come there. When the tone somewhere in camp rose a fraction, he turned his head, and every part of him, shoulders, hands, balance, shed pretense and pivoted toward the sound as one instrument. It was the kind of turn a person makes when they hear their name spoken in a crowd, immediate, exact, all else canceled. "Hey," I said, a word that can mean everything. He didn't answer. I touched his sleeve and used his name. The second time, his eyes found me. For a moment, his face filled with attention the way a window fills with sun when a cloud moves. Then it dimmed again. A softer, smaller self seated behind a windshield. "Headache," he said. Like a line through the ears, probably just dehydration. Kate suggested rest. He said he'd lie down. He walked instead along a maintenance corridor toward the sound, the way iron filings find a field. We have protocols for many things. We do not have a protocol for a person who is still themselves, except when they are not. Elise set a watch anyway, pairing people who would notice each other's small deviations. Reese took the dusk walk of the flag line with Santiago and came back pale under his frost mask. He had seen Hannes outside, standing without a coat at the edge of the snow berm, looking toward the generator with his head cocked as if listening to a second wind only he could hear. When Reese spoke his name, Hannes did not turn. When Reese put a coat around his shoulders, Hannes put his arms into the sleeves without looking down, as if the action came from memory alone. We don't have wildlife at Little Dome Sea. You can get used to the idea that nothing lives here, and then be surprised when the air itself behaves like an animal. The next morning, an inversion tucked cold into every crevice, dropping a glittering haze through the trenches. The sound carried differently. The beacon tone, if that's what it was, seemed underlaid by a lower note, something bodily. The generator coughed again, recovered, then ran fractionally rich, as if the air feed had sulfur in it that wasn't there yesterday. Tane used the comms window to raise Concordia. The reply came back clean and delayed. Weather closing there, fuel drums waiting for a traverse 2 days off. Keep the line of the days, call if that generator asks for more than you can give it. Elise signed off with the formality that keeps fear from making automatic hands clumsy. Copy. All personnel accounted for. All tasks paused until further notice. The lab quieted. We took stock. We moved the delicate things further from the edges, because edges fail first. We heated soup and said obvious things like, "We will sleep when we are tired," and "We will not invent stories that make us move too fast." We didn't talk about Hannes. By afternoon, the not quite in Hannes wasn't the only thing in the room. Dmitri started losing track of simple sequences. He would reach for a tool and pause halfway like someone standing in a doorway wondering why they came. Santiago responded to questions with a delay that made jokes land like aircraft in crosswinds. When I looked down the long lab corridor, I saw Kate standing very still, her head turned toward the location of a sound that wasn't there. Everyone felt it, and nobody knew what to name. I went back to my bench because what else does a scientist do? The lattice in the microscope had, against all reason, more definition. A repeating structure that looked like a snowflake remade by an engineer with a fondness for symmetry and echo. Not a cell. Not life as we define it. An arrangement that suggested response. I told myself a careful story. Something modal in the drilling fluid. Something the filters didn't catch. Something airborne in the cold room that had nothing to do with ice at all. Something electrical. Standing waves setting off that beacon by stray induction. Name the conventional first. Keep going down the list. At night, the wind came up, and all our worlds narrowed. Inside the trenches, the sound was close enough to be inside your head. Outside the trenches, in the open, the wind braided tracks across the flat with a brush that made no direction true. At midnight, the generator stuttered, and the lights stepped down a fraction. We lost one unit heater. The backup took the load and held. Elise. Sam's voice on the radio, calm because Sam only had one speed. I'd like to do a controlled shutdown and a strip down in the morning. Nothing in immediate crisis, but it feels like it's thinking about being temperamental. Copy, Elise said. We'll be ahead of it. We start early. We didn't make it to morning. The tone from the beacon woke me at 3:17 local, and I knew the time because the red digits on my watch made the inside of the tent feel like a submarine. The note was joined by a second, a harmonic that made my molars buzz. When I stepped into the trench, the air felt colder than its measure. The change was in me, not in the thermometer. 3 bunks were empty. I hurried toward the generator arch. There is a kind of snow that catches the light like powdered glass. It lay in a narrow drift across the threshold when I reached the arch, and there were footprints in it. Bare footprints, heel, smooth pad, toes pressed into crystals. I looked down at my own boots because I didn't have room in my mind yet for what the prints implied. The arch is a long ribbed space where the generator sits like a ship half carved out of ice. Frost grows there with a greed that makes shapes out of your breath. Hannes stood 10 meters from the running generator, coatless again, eyes open and astounding with focus. He was not alone. Dmitri stood beside him, and Kate both oriented toward the machine as if it were giving a lecture in a language they understood better than speech. The beacon tone existed now in the body of the generator sound. An overlay rather than a separate thing. The 3 of them breathed in unison. If you have ever seen a flock of birds turn at once, you have an image that matches what it felt like to watch them stand together. "Hey," I said again, "it's cold." It was the wrong thing to say and also the only thing. Sam came in on my left, slower than I wanted her to be, her hands open the way you keep them when talking to a skittish animal. "Friends," she said, "let's step back. We'll keep it safe. We made a plan." Hannes turned at her voice and stepped, not back but sideways, to keep the generator in the corner of his vision. Dmitri copied him almost perfectly. Kate's lips moved as if repeating something very quiet. When Sam spoke to her, Kate frowned like you do when a radio gets two signals at once. I didn't say zombie. It's a word that collapses complexity into a single wrong picture for comfort. But I thought, as a scientist thinks, something in the ice or on the ice making changes where brains keep time. Something that picked out tone and rhythm and wrote them through people like a new, cruel metronome. We tried the simplest interventions first. I reached up and snapped my fingers next to Dimitri's ear. Nothing. Reese shone a headlamp beam across Hannes's eyes. The pupils did what pupils do in light. Reflexes intact. A hand on a sleeve produced a slow reaction consistent with someone waking from a deep afternoon nap, interrupted. Kate blinked and found me with attention. "It's like the tune is closer than you are," she said, the sentence intact and grammatical, and then she turned back toward the motor that made the tune. "It is a gift to have adults in the room." Elise arrived and took the radio from her shoulder and said, "We are calling this what it is now. We have a group behavior we didn't choose. We are going to keep people warm, keep their fingers safe, and keep ourselves safe as well. Sam, can you do what you need with the generator if we walk people out of the arch?" "I can," Sam said, "but don't let them touch that exhaust." We made a human chain without putting our hands where the exhaust would find them. I took Dmitri by the elbow and said his name the way a friend says it. He turned slowly, as if dislodging himself from honey, and walked with me in a straight line out of the arch. In the trench, the wind noise felt like an empty stadium. Dimitri's eyes found the flag line we had hung above the floor as a wayfinding tool. He tracked it with the hungry attention he had given the generator, and my fear changed color. Tane stepped in with the radio and spoke to Elise quietly. "If the beacon tone is a magnet, we can make another magnet. I can set speakers behind the storage trench and throw a signal that draws. But we need power." "Do it," Elise said. "We'll budget." We had 12 hours of battery in the camp if we turned off everything that wasn't survival. Our fuel was down to the drums that waited for the traverse. Our generator would run, but any error now would be catastrophic. Sam wanted to open it and clean its breathings. Elise wanted to keep it on the rails until we could afford downtime. I took people out of the arch one by one. Each person moved with the same careful, measured economy. No pushing, no fight. A calm that made their faces look unusually young and unbearably old. We put them in warm sleeping bags in the living trench, paired with a non-entrained person to act as anchor. We spoke to them in old stories and in scientific explanations because both kinds of speech have rhythm that can compete with simpler notes. It helped for a while. Then we heard the beacon again. What made it worse was that the people who were changing weren't sick in any way medicine could point to. No fever, no tremor, no changes in skin or breath. Neurology intact except for attention and priority. The way they looked at tones, the way they tracked lines and hums, the way they moved in synchrony when a new sound arrived at the edge of hearing. It added up to something that felt like the oldest ghost being called. We had a night of it. The tone would appear, someone would stand. The person paired as anchor would speak and guide and hold. The wind wrote its 1,000 lines outside. We took turns sleeping in short spans you could count on one hand without using your thumb. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Sam and I opened the generator panel. We had to. The consumption numbers said the filters were doing more work than they should. When we shut down, the sudden quiet poured into the arch like water. "Fast hands," Sam said, and the two of us, with Elise and Reese as spotters, did the thing we had avoided. We pulled and replaced the parts that breathe and feed. The old filters glittered with snow like stalactites. Sam whistled without tone, a tiny wandering tune to keep the arch from feeling like a bell. When we restarted the generator, it came back with a voice like a person who slept and woke refreshed. For 3 hours, the camp felt normal. We pretended, we made coffee, we checked on those in sleeping bags. They ate when asked. They answered questions. They turned when the tone came, and only then. We kept the beacon off. The tone came anyway, somewhere. At midday, Tana and Dmitri, who had come back from the edge for intervals, rigged a pair of speakers on old sled runners. The speakers were for the tiny film festival we'd planned and wouldn't have because we were busy keeping everything that mattered on the right side of safe. Tane had a tone generator app on a tablet. He held it up like a prayer book. The plan was simple. We would set a tone the others wanted to follow, walk it down an unoccupied service trench, and leave it playing in a locked module so the rest of camp would be quiet. It felt like a trick to play on a child, and also like a decent way to keep people from wandering into hot machinery. I said so, and Elise nodded and said, "All good safety is simple like that." We picked a note as far from the generator's song as we could manage. We picked a rhythm for it, luxurious and slow, with changes every few minutes so it didn't become the kind of single truth the others craved. We moved the speakers. The entrained among us turned their heads. We guided them with outstretched hands the way you guide someone toward a table set with clean dishes. They followed, amenable and intent. When the speakers settled in their place, the entrained settled near them like a choir breaking after performance. It worked. For a while. When systems fail, they make patterns you recognize after you wish you had. The next failure wasn't the generator or the beacon, it was the roof. Snow tunnels live on borrowed time. The plastic roofs sag, the plywood stiffeners shift, the snow overhead creeps like a continental muscle. We monitor heights with a line we install on day 1. We watch for bowing. We move things. We dig relief. But the wind had dumped on us for 3 days straight, and the temperature swings wrote slow fractures we couldn't see. When the roof above the storage trench settled with a sigh and a crack and a shot of glittering snow, the speakers went from tone to choking static and then to silence. The people nearest them sat upright as one. Their faces turned not toward the speakers but toward the sound of rupture itself. Then they stood. What saved us in the next minutes was geography and habit. The collapse blocked one end of the storage trench. The other end was our side, and we were standing there staring at the broken roof like you stare at a broken tooth in a mirror. Elisa's voice cut across the shared breath of fear. "Everyone step back. We don't stack. We breathe like we've practiced." Reese and Sam were in motion already, their bodies choosing the work before their minds had time to pull. Some of the entrained moved with them, directly toward the moving shapes because motion had replaced tone as the loudest instruction. Hannes stepped into the falling snowstream with a calm too complete to be safe. There are words I will not use here. Words that make the platform frown. Words that put shocks in sentences. And if you're listening, you don't need them. What happened next was a tangle with rules underneath. We do not let people go under snow. We do not shout. We do not pull on a limb that could be pinned. We do not make a single problem into two. We built a sling out of lines and canvas. We made a lever out of a wooden spar and a crate. We lifted the fallen panel enough to slide Hannes back into air. He looked at us and threw us toward a shape none of us wanted him to find. "Asha," he said, and it was the first time my name sounded like a note in a larger instrument, not a word. "Stay with me," I answered, and he did for a breath and then returned to the hum that was his star. We couldn't hold the trench, not and keep everyone warm and present. Elise made a call that felt like an admission and was actually courage. We would move people to the surface shelters, the hard-sided blue boxes on skis we used for storms. Less comfort, more safety. We could vent them for fresh air. We could bolt them shut if we had to, not to make a prison, but a place where a person who wanted to walk could not walk toward a sound that would split their attention from their body. We staged the move the way you stage a traverse. Lines strung. Sleds loaded. Radios checked. The wind had dropped to a whispering level. The cold had settled into true inland numbers. The sky was a drum of pale cobalt. We walked people out in pairs, 2 anchors for each entrained. The untrained walked with neat economy, their steps measured, their faces calm. When the wind hit them, they blinked like owls, adjusted, and then kept watching where the sound was. On the surface, the world felt right-sized and wrong, both. Flags led away in 2 directions like choices in a parable. Our shelters stood on their skis with their doors facing downwind. Tane's weather display on his wrist read -32 without wind. Our eyelashes tried to turn into jewelry. We moved fast, but not rushed. Inside the first shelter, I helped Kate settle Hannes into a sleeping bag spread on top of closed stowage crates. She did doctor things with quiet emphasis, checked his nails, looked inside his mouth, listened to his heart. When she straightened, she wore the expression medics wear in remote places when their equipment is fine and their patient is not, a mind measuring the distance between available and needed. "This isn't fever. It isn't oxygen. It isn't anything with an easy lever," she said softly. "But he follows your voice for a breath at a time. Use that." We anchored the shelters with lines through their lashing eyes and packed snow against their skids. We left the doors cracked for air and closed for safety. We took turns sitting just inside the threshold talking about ordinary things, what we would cook next week, the way dust drifts looked pink at certain hours, the silly arguments between drill teams and corps handlers about the right level of artistry in a perfectly shaved slice. The untrained people stayed quiet, and in the warm dimness, a version of peace returned. There were 7 of us still moving freely, 4 of us entrained to different degrees. Our power budget was now a knife. We could keep the generator running, but we were into reserve drums and the traverse was, according to the last call, still pinned by wind 80 kilometers out. We rationed light. We rationed heat. We rationed words. Elise took the satellite phone into the lee of a snow wall and called Concordia again. Whatever she heard there squeezed the color from her face when she came back. "Bad news is traveling in this weather," she said finally. "They're seeing people at other inland sites doing this. Different details, same shape. And the traverse is delayed another day. We can keep batteries up. We can keep the generator running. Sam says she can make it hum on a diet, but we have to plan for being our own help for 2 days." I felt the idea of 2 days like the way you feel an altitude you're not acclimated to. "We can keep them safe," I said, meaning it and also knowing we were promising something to ourselves as much as to them. That night, under a sky so clear it seemed to ring, the tone returned again, not from the beacon, not from the generator, from the ice itself, a creature of long pipes and branching corridors. It came through the walls of the shelter like music through a neighbor's apartment. The entrained people sat up as one. I had been thinking about the lattice in the microscope, about the way it held shape without being alive in the way we define life. about the way tone had become a form of gravity. I had been telling myself a myth, that something old had found a new instrument. I stopped telling the myth and started thinking like an engineer. "Tane," I said into the radio, "what happens if we set a tone that cancels what they're hearing?" He knew what I meant: destructive interference, two waves, same frequency, opposite phase, subtract one another to silence. He was already doing the math, already thinking about how tone propagates in snow and ice, how reflections complicate simple pictures. "We can try," he said. "We'll need a clean sample of the tone and a way to stay in phase with it where they are. We can put a sensor in with them," I said, meaning a small microphone, "then adjust in real time." "Let's play careful," Elise said. "No surprises. If it gets worse, we cut it." We set a sensor in the shelter where Hannes sat because he was the one who responded most strongly and because we were resigned to using our friend as a gauge. Tane built the inverse on a tablet with an app that wasn't made for this and yet was exactly made for this, because someone wrote it knowing that people out in the world improvise. Dmitri held the speaker with fixity like a monk holds a relic. We listened to the tone in our headsets and then to its echo, and then to both together when Tane pressed play. The silence that followed was not total, nothing is. But the tone dropped like a curtain. The three entrained in that shelter sagged as if a string had gone slack. Hannes's eyes fluttered and found mine, and held this time. "Hi," I said. "Hi," he said, and his voice was central again. "How long can we do this?" Elise asked, practical over the radio. "As long as we have batteries," Tane said. "As long as the phase doesn't drift. As long as the tone doesn't change." The tone changed within the hour. Of course it did. It shifted by a fraction of a hertz, so slow and so quiet you would never have noticed unless your heart had learned to count in paces. Tane adjusted. It worked again. A new shift came, quicker. Tane adjusted faster. The third shift slurred into a chord. The snow itself was not a chamber. It was an orchestra, and it had found its second instrument. "We need another plan," I said, and felt the silliness of that sentence even as I said it. We had a plan. It worked for a moment. That moment ended. Santiago, who had been quiet, perhaps because he had been measuring something in his head only he could see, spoke into the radio softly, as if not to startle us. "The old dust layers act as waveguides," he said. "Thin planes, kilometers long, where sound at certain low frequencies travels with almost no loss. If something in the ice is coupling to those planes, then what we're hearing here could be coming from any direction, and many places at once. We can quiet one spot, but the orchestra can bring in the horns." "So we move the orchestra," Dmitri said, and even entrained he smiled at his own joke. "Or we find a way to break the waveguide," Reese said. "You can cut an avalanche path with explosives in mountains. Sorry, with disruption charges. But out here, we do not have that luxury. And we're not making anything that size in the lab," I said quickly, "because there are lines and a world watching." Elise let the silence sit. Leaders do that because people will fill it with solutions or with fear. Either way, you learn who you have. "We can lead," Kate said. "Not cancel, attract. If we can set a tone more compelling than the one in the ice and keep it moving, we can walk our people toward a place we want them to be." "To the skiway," Elise said, and we all looked up as if we could see it through snow and sky. Our skiway was a groomed stripe on flat ground a kilometer from camp, marked by flags and bamboo and a row of small beacons we only used when field aircraft came. It had survived the last storm. The Trevors couldn't get to us yet, but aircraft could in a weather window and with fuel, and the network had more of both than anyone else. Twin Otter could come from Concordia if they can spare one, Tane said. Basler could carry more. We have fuel to prime the beacons once, maybe twice. It means walking, Elise said, with our friends in tow. It means trusting the wind not to pick up. It means trusting that we know our own flag lines better than we know our own names. Then we lead, I said. And it wasn't heroic, it was the next step in a line. We built a moving tone. 2 sleds with speakers, a sound designed to be more interesting than the slow chant in the ice. We made it out of human voices and a field recording of wind through bamboo and the soft thump of Sam's glove on a crate, repeated and turned into a pulse that had pattern without being trance. We rehearsed inside a shelter with the door open. The untrained among us tracked the sound, then blinked and found us when we spoke their names. It wasn't a cure, it was a lead rope. We started at 14 o'clock local, with the sky a flat light that made everything appear only in edges. Reese took point. Elise floated where leaders float. Not in front, not in back, but where the line is weakest. I walked with Hannes, his arm lightly through mine like a careful dance. Kate walked beside Dimitri. Tane and Sam pulled the speaker sled slow and steady so the sound neither raced ahead nor lagged. Santiago and Dimitri had sketched the route like a river, with eddies of rest at places where the drift was lower. We had radios in each ear and a voice in each hand. The first 100 meters were a minute and a year. The entrained walked with the same unhurried attention they had given the generator, but out here the note had competition. The sound of snow crushed under boots, the slow clicking of bamboo, the far breath of the planet. I spoke Hannes's name in intervals and told him the kinds of stories I tell first-year students on their first day in the cold room. The difference between visible and invisible ice, how to read a bubble layer, why old air is the most romantic thing you will ever hold. He laughed once, a sound that was all his. Halfway to the skiway, the wind began to climb a ladder. We felt it first as a change in the way the flags moved, then as spindrift building like smoke along the ground. The tone from the speakers lost a fraction of clarity. The tone from the ice found that loss and pushed into it. We tightened the line without touching. The entrained leaned into the sound like hikers lean into a slope. At the last rise, before the skyway, the sky made up its mind to be a place rather than a mood. The light grayed. The flags made short, angry movements. We saw the beacons because they were closer than they should have been. Distance compresses in weather. Tane jogged ahead and warmed the beacons with a miserly burn. They woke like thoughtful eyes in blue housings. We had enough fuel to keep them alive long enough for an approach if an approach came. "Comms," Elise said, and Tane ducked into a hollow behind a snow block and spoke into the sat phone with the measured cadence of a person in a movie pretending to be calm. When he came back, he didn't lift the receiver away from his ear as fast as I wanted him to. "Kiwi craft, inbound," he said finally, synth smooth with relief. "Twin Otter first. Basler 30 behind if the winds that take pity on us take pity on them too. We'll have 2 chances to make a thing that is hard look easy." The first aircraft announced itself in the thin sky with a sound like punctuation, a sentence arriving at a chapter break. The Twin Otter lined up on our little universe and landed like a careful hand on a fragile shoulder, snow dusting into its prop arcs. The pilot taxied down the skiway with that combination of ceremony and practicality I have seen in all pilots who make deliveries where maps are more hope than geography. He turned and set his tail to the wind so we could walk people into the cabin without climbing a ladder of air. The door opened. A person leaned out with a grin that said, "I have done this before, and I will do it again until the world says stop." We had rehearsed for this on day 3 with a drill that felt like a game. Now it was not a game. We walked Hannes and Dmitri to the door with the tone steady and our lids frosted. Each entrained person recognized the doorway as a shape that mattered, the way we all do because doors are ancient. Hands reached, gloves touched. The first two disappeared into the warm interior, and for a moment my breath hitched because the task slipped its most dangerous hinge. The idea that only these two, and not the others, might make it. Then the idea passed, and the line moved again. We loaded 4 on the first run, the 2 most entrained, and 2 whose faces had begun to take on that stillness I had come to fear. The aircraft turned and found sky and was smaller than my thumb in 5 heartbeats. The tone in the snow changed with their leaving, as if the orchestra had lost a section. Our own tone drew tighter around us, and, for a few minutes, I felt the sensation I had missed for hours. Space in my own head. We waited with our backs to the wind. We drank from bottles that tried to turn into sculptures. We told stories to our radios about food we would cook when everything had edges again. The second aircraft sound grew out of the wind like a reward. The Basler came in heavier, lower, its props throwing a crisp signature across the flat. It touched down, moved toward us, and pivoted in a slow, competent arc. The door opened. The cabin was bigger, the smell of heated air and engine oil strange and lush. We walked the remaining entrained aboard, and then someone put a hand on my shoulder and said my name, and I realized they were including me in that group, and I shook my head because I had not finished being the person who holds the rope. "We have room," Elise said gently, "and you have done enough for one day." "I still have samples to ruin with my curiosity," I said, and she smiled in a way that made my breath fog differently. "You'll ruin them later," she said. "You're coming now." Leaders do not ask. They tell when it matters. I stepped into the aircraft and sat, knees touching the person opposite, gloves still on because I didn't trust my fingers. The door closed. The tone in the ice became a memory on the other side of a wall. The engines pressed us back into our seats and then released us into a climb that felt like sitting up after a too long sleep. On the way to Concordia, the pilot spoke over the cabin speakers with a voice that sounded like the best of us. Practical, unsentimental, kind. "We've got you," he said. "This route is domesticated. It knows our name." At Concordia, they moved us through warm corridors with pictures on the walls, and the same smell every station has, the friendship of too many socks and borrowed air. The medic there, another Kate with a different last name, looked into our eyes and said the grounding things we needed, and none of the speculative ones we did not. They quarantined us from the wider base in a way that felt like care rather than fear. They called other places and asked for news and gave it back to us when we had the energy to hear it. News trickled in like snowmelt. Other sites inland had described similar behaviors. People orienting towards tones, toward line-of-sight indicators, toward rhythmic machinery. Coastal stations saw less of it, perhaps because the sea talks in white noise and never in pure notes. Some people returned fully quickly, some slowly, some in waves, depending on soundscapes. Nobody had fevers. Nobody had classic signs of infection. Everything had the signature of something acting through attention and rhythm. The old ice had given us a new teacher, and it taught in notes rather than words. Back at Little Dome C, the second Twin Otter and a ground team who knew our trenches moved the remaining gear and people in a methodical, no-drama way that made my heart work correctly again. When Sam stepped off the aircraft at Concordia 8 hours after me, she punched the air once and then hugged me without saying anything that would make this a story I can't share. We stayed for evaluation. We gave blood not because it would answer anything, but because it was a thing medicine can do. We answered questions about our attention as if we were in a psychology study. Hannes shook his head at least once every hour, as if clearing a tuning fork from his brain. But his eyes were his own. Dmitri built a radio out of spare parts because that's how he lives. Kate slept sitting up in a chair with a book open like a tent over her chest. Elise wrote a report with a pen and paper because screens felt like an instrument we weren't ready to trust for messages different than sound. I went to the small lab Concordia gave me and pulled up the images of the lattice I had archived in my private directory. In better light, and with a head that had slept once, I saw it with necessary humility. Not a virus in the way people mean the word, not something trying to live in a body. A structure that forms when conditions line up, as frost forms on a window into ferns and feathers. Something that makes resonant cavities in brine-bound crystal that can hold a tone across distances like a violin holds one in a room. A way the planet plays itself when coaxed. A physical phenomenon with biological consequences because we are animals with ears and rhythms and brains that want to synchronize with anything orderly enough. It didn't matter because it mattered to us. Understanding is a gift with a handle you can hold. If this was a kind of environmental resonance that recruited human attention, then the tools to address it were not vaccines or pills, but architecture and sound. You build quieter machines. You decouple tones. You interrupt clean waveguides with small chaos. You keep radios on squelch rather than open carriers. You make your alarms more complicated than a single note. You play human voices, the original complicated signal on loops that vary. You teach people to throw attention ropes to one another when the air decides to sing. Weeks later, in a conference call that gathered scattered field teams into one strip of faces, we traded simple victories. A site near Dome Fuji reported that their people returned to themselves when the generator's exhaust note was damped by a fabric sleeve that broke its purity. A Traverse team realized their fuel pumps hummed at frequencies that lined up with the dust layers and moved those pumps onto mats that blurred them. A drilling team near Dome A changed the way their bore fluid vented, so it never stood as a column long enough to become an organ pipe. It was prosaic fieldcraft against an elegant ghost. When Concordia's winter came on and our summer world scattered back to continents and living rooms and offices with carpet, I had a week in Christchurch where rain sounded like civilization. I walked past a music store and felt my shoulders rise with the noise somebody was making inside. A flutist practicing long tones, careful and pure. It was beautiful and harmless, and my heart beat a little faster anyway. Our brains are quick learners. They remember weather. Back in Seattle, I wrote a paper that used words careful enough for any platform. We described a field syndrome in which attention could be entrained by periodic acoustic sources propagating through subglacial environments. We said we suspected coupling between dust-bound saline layers and low-frequency machinery nodes. We said mitigations were low-tech and immediate. We said the phenomenon was rare and required unlikely alignments, and yet not so rare we would ignore it again. In the evenings, I recorded this account, the first-person piece that would only ever be a footnote in the formal literature. You do not write the story of your friends in the tone of a methods section. You use their names. You tell how they moved. You try to place the smell of warm, insulating foam and instant coffee into an archive that doesn't know how to store smell. You say that nobody was hurt in the ways we fear. You say that we learned a thing about the ice and about ourselves. People asking after the fact like to reach for the word we refused. I say the word doesn't help. I say there are old things in the ice and not all of them are alive in the way we are, and not all of them are master plans. Some are physics that uses us because we are made of rhythm and respond to rhythm. We are susceptible to the metronome, but we are also good at syncopation. We can throw our attention off beat and catch it again. We can sing together and drown an oscillator." A month later, an email arrived from Hannes with a subject line that made me laugh. We broke the generator's perfect pitch. He attached a short video of a drill tender tapping a bent bracket with a glove. The sound it made was hideous, complex, beating, like a frictioned wine glass that didn't choose a single note but all of them at once. In another message, Kate reported that she'd started testing station alarms with volunteers listening for how quickly they drew the body rather than the mind. "If it makes you stand without thinking, it goes in the bin," she wrote. "If it makes you think first, and only then rise, it stays." Elise sent a photograph from a refitted trench, strips of heavy foam cut into irregular shapes and tacked along a corridor. "We are decorating," she wrote. "Functionally. Beauty is a byproduct." And from Dmitri, a schematic drawn in clean lines that showed nothing secret and everything human. A small device that listened to a space and, if it found too much order, added a whisper of pleasant disorder, the sound of water through pebbles, the rustle of paper. "We are building weather," he wrote. And I read that line 3 times because sometimes the poet sneaks into the engineer and surprises you. On the last warm day before our autumn turned honest, I sat in a park where gulls argued and children tested the structural limits of playground equipment. I closed my eyes and listed the tones I could hear. Leaf, shoe, distant bus brake, the sub-bass of a ship 3 miles away in the port. None of them were single truths. All of them were messy. It was an orchestra of everything, which is to say a comfortable room for an animal like us. There are still nights when I wake and hear a note that does not belong and turn to orient toward it, because that is what my body learned one winter on a continent that teaches by subtraction. When that happens, I say my friends' names, the living ropes we throw across gaps, and I put on music with a pulse that stumbles just enough to break any spell. It's a small ritual, and like all rituals, it fools the parts of me that need to be fooled into feeling safe. Then I sleep again, and when the morning comes, I carry coffee out onto a damp stair and listen to the complicated tone of rain. It's the right kind of song. If this ever finds its way to you in a place where alarms are perfect and hums are clean, take it as a quiet suggestion from a cold place. Let nothing in your world sing in a single pure voice for too long. Keep the beat human. Leave edges imperfect. Remember that even under a glacier, where light is a rumor, the first instrument that brought us back was one another, saying each other's names in the right rhythm at the right time. And if you ever hear a tone in the wind that makes your feet want to move without your say-so, stop, breathe, call for a friend, and make sure the friend answers with a voice that trips. That voice will carry you through. Months after the field season, a logistics officer sent me a note. The traverse that had been delayed finally arrived at our small, abandoned camp. They found our trenches caved in the way snow caves in, slowly and then suddenly, with old plywood folded like the pages of a book. They found the generator arch sealed to a whisper. They cut in carefully to recover instruments and spares because waste is the unforgivable offense out there. "We stood in the arch a long time," she wrote. "A few of us thought we heard something in the metal. Then one of us started humming, and everyone laughed and said no more ghosts. We went back to work." In the end, the ice kept our footprints and then took them, which is what it does. We left behind the quiet lessons you only learn by being taught. That tone can take a person a few steps away from themselves, and that people can step back when called by names spoken in loving, clumsy, human time. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.